All right, welcome back in Live Now. I'm Austin Westfall. President Trump remains adamant that his administration will engage in, quote, direct nuclear talks with Iran on Saturday in Oman, while Tehran appears to remain equally steadfast in its insistence that the negotiations will be, quote, indirect. Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff is scheduled to travel to Oman, where he could potentially be meeting with Iran's foreign minister, though the Iranian officials that Axios has spoken to have so far maintained that the talks will be held through a third party. To break this down and much more, including news out of Gaza as well, Dr. Alon Burstein is here. As always, Alon, it's good to see you. Let's start off with our viewer question. We did get some in, and I want to make sure that we get in Lee from Indianapolis. He asks, what is the long-term goal of Washington wanting to approach Iran? And I'll also add something onto that. What is Iran's long-term goal of wanting to speak with the U.S.? Why are they doing this? Why is it in both parties' interest?
It's good to see you, Austin. So probably later we're going to talk about the specific conversations that may be had between the two of them. So really, I will focus on that question of the long-term goal. What might be an overall strategy? And here, we really have to look to the way the United States and Iran look at the Middle East. In the Middle East is a couple of big powers. Israel is not necessarily huge geographically, but militarily, it is certainly one of the powers and one of the more influential countries. Then there are countries like Saudi Arabia, which is very influential in the world because of its array of alliances, but also because, obviously, of its oil production. And it is constantly challenged by Iran. Both of them are vying for leadership of the Islamic world from different perspectives, from the Shiite perspective and from the Sunni perspective. With that, we have to factor that in when we look at the long-term aspirations. The United States would like to see, under the Trump administration, has been open about the fact that it wants to see an end to wars and an end to armed conflict. For that, you need to have in the Middle East all sides deciding that it's in their interest to cooperate. So, while we have Saudi Arabia, a staunch ally of the United States, and wanting a defense alliance with the United States, they are very fearful of Iran going forward with a nuclear program. Prior to the current administration and the first Trump administration, Saudi Arabia even threatened to possibly start their own nuclear program if they didn't have assurances of protection from the United States. The United States has a long-term interest in Iran scaling back its nuclear program so that it continues to develop its own regional alliances with Saudi Arabia, with Qatar, possibly even with the new regime in Syria. We're waiting to see where that develops. That's the interest from the United States perspective. And then, of course, there's also the question of Israel and Iran's support for terror groups and threats against Israel. Meanwhile, within Iran, the main interest for Iran is, number one, to lift the sanctions. The economy in Iran has been severely crippled by sanctions of the United States over the years. And the new president, who was a more moderate within the framework of the radical Iranian regime, the new president has really sort of set his goals on trying to rebuild the economy. So that's long-term aspiration number one. And the long-term aspiration number two for Iran is really to bide its time and to some extent rebuild. Iran has lost a major ally with the fall of the Assad regime in Syria. Iran also, to some extent, lost a major political card and military card with the way Hezbollah has been diminished, at least, in Lebanon. And to some extent, Iran needs a situation to scale down in order to begin rebuilding its strength in the Middle East, in order to see how it can maybe challenge Saudi Arabia and Israel later on. That's really the long-term aspirations of both sides, bringing them at this point to a mutual interest in actually talking to each other.
Then that brings me to the question that I brought up in the introduction, which is indirect versus direct talks. Why does that even matter?
So this is a very interesting case, I'll say, when it comes to sort of international politics between quote-unquote Western powers and the quote-unquote non-Western powers. Typically, when we look at the non-Western powers, whether it is Syria, Hamas, over the years, the PLO, the Taliban, all of those different countries have wanted talks to always be direct, whether it is with Russia, with the United States, with the EU, with Israel. They want direct talks very often because they want to show that they are being recognized, that they are an important player. The Syrian regime wants to talk to the United States. Hamas was very open to direct talks, not with Israel, but with the United States even. They want to be recognized as legitimate players, and usually it's the Western countries that actually say, I'm a little weary. I'm a little weary of actually being seen to be talking to you directly. This is a reversal where it is actually the Trump administration that is insisting that talks are going to be direct, and Iran that is being coy about that. Now, why is that happening? To this, we have to look more to the intricacies of internal politics in both countries. Within the Trump administration, there is first and foremost a desire to show that Trump is there to make business. Trump wants to get a deal. His approach to political deals internationally has always been we cut to the chase. We cut to the chase. We make a deal. I don't waste time. I don't waste time with indirect talks. I don't waste time with all kinds of things. And, he even broke with a longstanding tradition. The United States doesn't speak to terrorists. The first Trump administration spoke directly to the Taliban and made a deal. It's all about just pushing forward. And to quote what was said in the administration, we're going to have direct talks. We're not going to let the Iranian regime waste time with indirect talks. So that's the Trump approach. Meanwhile, within Iran, there is a very delicate balance of power within the current Iranian regime. Within Iran, the ultimate leader is the one we're seeing on screen right now, the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, who is considered much more radical. And then within the politicians, there are two different streams. There's the more conservative and the more reformist. And the current president is much more of a reformist nature. He's much more someone who says, even though I want to preserve the Islamic Republic, it is actually in our interest to possibly, appease certain countries and not necessarily invest all our money in Hezbollah or Hamas. It is possibly in our interest to not just try to export the revolution, but actually conserve our regime internally. And with that, it's a very delicate balance of power. If the current president of Iran were to come out and openly say, I am going to talk and shake hands with the president of the United States, he would be in a lot of trouble internally, politically, because he's a reformist and he would be heavily criticized and even possibly ousted by the more extreme elements within his regime. So that, I think, when we look at the internal politics of both sides, has really sort of flipped the table in the sense that it is the United States that's saying only direct talks, that's what we're going to have, and Iran saying only indirect talks. Now, what is likely to happen? Likely we're going to find a middle ground. Likely there will be some direct talks between the sides, but they'll make some excuse that it was low-level direct talks, and really the main talks were the indirect talks. And another thing that I'll just say that's important is that Iran recognizes that this is important to the United States and has already suggested that this is going to be a bargaining chip. Has already suggested, well, if the United States it's so important to the United States to have direct talks, okay, then possibly we demand as a precursor to those direct talks, A, B, and C, because they see that this is important to the Trump administration at this time. So theoretically, what does it matter? It shouldn't matter, but actually it's become a very interesting part of the political game.
And I guess time will tell. We'll see what happens on Saturday, and I'd be curious to know, too, about the short term here. We started off by asking about the long term. So in the immediate term, obviously what they're discussing here is Iran's nuclear program. What do we know about Iran's nuclear program? And maybe I should preface this. What do we reliably know about their nuclear program?
So the nuclear program is really seen first and foremost as a threat to Israel, and then as a threat to Europe, and then possibly as a threat to the United States. But really, if we actually break it down, it's not necessarily a credible threat to anyone because all those countries have more nuclear weapons than Iran has. It's more a guarantee that Iran wants in order to protect its regime and its administration. If you have nuclear weapons, then you can't attack us at will. If we have nuclear weapons, then you can't mess with us when we want to stir in what's going on in Lebanon or in Yemen or in Syria. And that's why Iran, theoretically at least, wants nuclear weapons. In order to have effective nuclear capability, you need two things. You need missiles that can have nuclear warheads that are mounted onto them. And then you need enough enriched uranium in order to create the material for a nuclear bomb. And that is really what the focus is right now. Iran already has missiles that can carry nuclear warheads. But what they're still missing is enough enriched uranium to the point that they can actually make a bomb. Now, what do we know about the levels of enriched uranium that Iran has? It's hard to say what we know that is credible because Israel says one thing, the International Nuclear Agency says something else, the United States says something else, Iran says something else. It is difficult to know. What seemingly there's no dispute is that Iran has enough enrichment capabilities such that if they wanted, they could actually jump ahead and enrich enough uranium for a couple of crude bombs within a matter of weeks. So that there's seemingly no dispute. Some say no, it would be a matter of months if they tried to push ahead. Others would say no, it's a matter of weeks. Some have said a matter of days. Obviously, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. In terms of what the sides are hoping to achieve, they're really coming at these talks from entirely different perspectives. Iran would, according to its own internal publications, would very much like to reenact the previous nuclear deal that happened under the Obama administration back in negotiated 2014 and 2015, 2016. And really, what that deal was meant to do was to delay its enrichment capabilities. That deal limited the amount of uranium that Iran could have, the amount of enrichment processes that Iran could go through, and was really limiting it for 10 years in order to theoretically delay the possibility that Iran would get to a bomb. Iran would like to recreate some sort of deal like that. The Trump administration is coming at this from an entirely different perspective. The Trump administration is coming from the point of ensuring that Iran does not have the capability to go ahead, rather than having a deal that then relies on Iran's actually complying with that deal. Trump administration is talking about dismantling Iran's nuclear facilities. Then there was some pulling back on that, saying maybe they'll be able to have civilian nuclear power plants and things like that. But really, the Trump administration is coming from the point of not making a deal in order to delay, but rather in order to cancel out. And it's important to note in the deal between, in the meeting between President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu was really pushing Trump towards this direction, and he kept on bringing up the Libyan model. He kept on saying that what has to happen if we are to go forth with negotiations is you have to aspire for the Libyan model. What happened in Libya is Libya had pursued its own nuclear program since the 1960s, and that was always seen as a threat to the international community. Then 9/11 happens. 9/11 happens. The United States has decided it's not accepting any more rogue countries with weapons of mass destruction. We see the invasion of Afghanistan, we see the invasion of Iraq. And in 2003, the Libyan regime under Gaddafi unilaterally announces, you know what? We're willing to actually give up our nuclear program. And they did it in a very genuine way. They invited American inspectors in to the power plants to themselves take out missiles, to themselves take out uranium, to themselves come and inspect. It was really done in a way that Libya said, you know what, it's actually in our interest to show the United States we're on your side at this moment. Netanyahu is pushing Trump to aspire for something like that. I think it's highly unlikely that we'll see a model like that in Iran. But in theory, those are the two directions that the sides are coming from to the negotiations. Iran wanting a deal that will be similar to the previous deal, postponing its program in exchange for economic benefits and relieving sanctions. And the Trump administration wanting complete cancellation of the program. And importantly, I'll just say, without really saying what Iran gets in response, maybe it's implied that there will be, to some extent, lifting of the sanctions and some sort of economic incentive. But the United States is not saying what it would be offering Iran in return. And that will be very interesting because if, for example, the United States says, and we'll invest in your oil capabilities, Saudi Arabia is going to have what to say about that. If the United States, as part of the negotiation, says, give up your nuclear program and we'll consider our regional alliances, Israel is going to have what to say about that. So no one's really talking about that yet. But that's an interesting thing. What is the United States going to offer in response or as an incentive to Iran in order to progress in its direction? Like you said, we'll learn more.
So why in Oman? Why is there any significance of Oman just because they're looking for a third-party territory, or is there something more significant than that?
Pretty much. Oman is one of the few Middle East countries that is at the moment not really involved in any conflict, number one. And number two, doesn't really have a stake right now within the balance of power between the United States, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Palestine, and Iran. If we look at Qatar, it's a country that on the one hand has befriended a lot of people. On the other hand, it befriends Israel and the United States as well as Hamas. But Qatar is not a friend to Iran. Then the United Arab Emirates, also good relations with a lot of different countries. They're seen as a rival of Iran. Yemen is a dismantled country. Saudi Arabia is clearly on the side that opposes Iran. It's hard to find a lot of countries in the Middle East that do not have an actual stake in the conflict. Oman, I would wager a lot of people have not even heard about it. And the reason they haven't heard about it is because it's a country that is, they're near Saudi Arabia, not involved in terrorism, not involved in international controversy. To that extent, it's actually an ideal country for the parties to say, you know what, let's talk here. It'll be interesting to see if the talks don't go well, if Oman says, get out. We don't want to host these anymore because we don't want to be seen as complicit to this. Oman has survived. It's a small country, not a strong military, has survived by staying out of conflict this entire time. So, but to some extent, it's the ideal country because it doesn't actually have a stake in what's going on in these negotiations.
Whether it's direct or whether it's indirect, what is the significance of the U.S. and Iran having talks at all? How often does something like that happen?
It's very significant, the fact that there are very public negotiations. There's always back channel negotiations between all countries. Even the worst rivals always have back channel negotiations. The viewers might remember even during the Cold War, right? There was still back channel talks between the Soviet Union and the United States to make sure that one side doesn't accidentally misinterpret something that's happening as a nuclear launch for the other side. No matter how big the rivals are, there's always back channel negotiations. What is significant here is the fact that these talks are very public, that they're being done under a president that seemingly came in last time canceling the deal and reimposing sanctions, now all of a sudden seemingly taking a new turn, that is very significant, and that there's a different array of power within Iran and its proxies in the Middle East, that they have a lot less capabilities to threaten regional war. To some extent, we've already seen the outbreak of the regional war, and Iran is in a much weaker position than it was a year ago. And to that extent, it is very significant that the talks are public, that they're high level. According to some reports, Trump himself, when he was in a meeting in the United Nations, wanted to actually go and shake hands with the Iranian foreign minister, and his staff directed him away from it because they didn't want that handshake yet. But Trump seemingly wants to just charge ahead in order to get this deal. And in that sense, it's very significant that there are talks. There's always talks under every single administration. Even under the first Trump administration, when the sanctions were returned, there were still talks. Who represents the United States in Iran is often the Swedish embassy or other embassies from the EU who, convey indirectly what the United States is saying and back from Iran. There's always talks, but the high level of them, the fact that they're public, the fact that they're being done explicitly in order to talk about these things, that is really the significant development here. And really what's important, I would say, is where we are next week. We're now talking, it's Friday, the talks are starting on Saturday. What's really important is where will we be next Friday? Because the talks will happen, and even if the sides vastly disagree, talks go terribly, that doesn't mean they're over. That could still mean that they're going to go ahead. What is the conversation we're having next week? Are we actually saying the talks were good and we're going ahead? Or are we saying the talks were a good starting point and now we're going to see and we're not sure? That's going to be the big question, because no one's going to walk away with a deal, and no one's going to walk away saying we're going to war. But we're going to have to sort of take hints from how sides are reporting about this. Are we looking at they've started the channel and there's going to be higher level negotiations? Or is that there was a meeting and now we're going to wait and see, which really means now we're just in a stalling tactic?
The people are used to seeing you and I talking about Gaza. And I got to ask if there is any connection to the Israel-Hamas war when you think about the stakes of this meeting on Saturday. I mean, we always talk about Hamas being an Iran-backed group, but at this point, I guess my question would be, how connected to Hamas is Iran? I mean, Gaza is pretty tightly closed, correct? So, one, is there any connection to the Israel-Hamas war potentially with these talks tomorrow? And two, how connected are Iran and Hamas at this point?
So, first of all things are connected in the Middle East, right? There's always a regional array of when something happens, the sides then all of a sudden react. A lot of people say the October 7th attack happened because of possible normalization talks between Israel and Saudi Arabia. I myself do not necessarily stand by that, but a lot of people do say that. Everything is very intertwined. Is there a direct connection between them? I would say at this point, not necessarily. It's not like that Iran may condition the United States halting Israel's advance in Gaza on continuation of the talks or something like that. But that we'll see if that develops. Right now, that is not part of the negotiations. Where there is much more of a connection is in the relationship between the United States and Israel, and specifically Trump and Netanyahu. Because when Trump came into the White House in Israel, this was seen as the Messiah has come in. The different members of parliament who are part of the government were saying finally we'll be able to charge ahead and win the war. Trump doesn't care about Palestinians, doesn't care about Gazans. These are all things that were said publicly by the Israeli government. Then all of a sudden Trump comes in and tells Netanyahu, actually, we've arrived at a deal and I'd like you to go to a ceasefire. And now Israel has returned to fighting in the Gaza Strip. But there's another question, when is Trump going to get tired of that? Trump himself, as we said before, does not like wars, does not like conflict, wants things to just spiral down. And in Israel, there's a lot of consideration for the fact that Trump eventually is going to probably stop saying, yes, just rain hell down on them if he can get a deal that secures the release of more hostages in exchange for a truce or even a long-term ceasefire. So in that sense, Israel's dependency on the United States, and specifically Netanyahu on Trump, really is what plays a factor here with regards to the war. Netanyahu is now dealing with Trump. He's not dealing with Obama. He's not dealing with Biden. He's not dealing with an administration that he can say, they're against us, and even if they abandon us, we don't care. Like he said about Biden, we'll fight with our hands and nails at the end of the day. With Trump, that's different. You can't talk that way. It will be very risky. Trump is unpredictable. He could decide to all of a sudden change his policies towards Israel. In that sense, when Trump invited Netanyahu to the White House, really Netanyahu ended up sitting there saying exactly what he didn't want to say. Exactly smiling and saying, obviously, we'll give a chance to talks. Netanyahu has a million times said, you only need sanctions and you need to attack Iran. You mustn't have talks. So in that sense, it's very connected to the war in the sense that Trump does actually have possibly a bargaining chip with Iran because he can make Israel stop the war, possibly go to another deal, or things like that. One more thing I'll say with regards to your question of the ties between Iran and Hamas. Historically, Iran has been a big backer of Hamas, both financially and militarily. But it is not an arm of Iran as much as people sometimes make it out. Hezbollah is an arm of Iran. Hezbollah could be considered almost a military wing of Iran doing exactly what Iran says. The Houthis, not as much as Hezbollah, but much more connected to Iran. Hamas have their own array of considerations. Hamas are a Palestinian group. They're an Islamist group. They're backed by Iran. They all object to Israel's existence and to peace treaties and to a two-state solution. However, Iran, for example, was not consulted before the October 7th attack. There's some documents that show that Hamas may have told them, but it doesn't actually show that Hamas told them. It said that Hamas was planning something, and that's why Hezbollah didn't know about it. Iran does not control Hamas in the same way. It's much more, though, a relationship that has a lot of historic ties, but right now Iran is busy elsewhere. Again, it's lost Syria, it's lost Hezbollah. Like you said, its ability to smuggle weapons into Hamas and Gaza is not what it used to be. So there is a connection there. There's an ideological connection. There's historically a financial connection, and it's still there and probably will be rebuilt in the future if Hamas, once the war does die down. But at this point, it's a lot weaker than it used to be.
So what's been happening? It's been over a week since I've talked with you. Since then, we've had, as you mentioned, a Netanyahu visit to D.C., and a lot's been going on in Gaza. What has been happening in Gaza as of late?
So what we've seen is the IDF advancing and really deepening its military incursion of the Gaza Strip in a couple of different arenas. One of them is the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, and there's been some very high-profile assassinations that happened there on April 9th. The IDF assassinated the Sajaiya brigade commander of Hamas. And then today, on April 11th, another big commander of the Tel Sultan region in southern Gaza was also assassinated. The IDF has expanded its ground invasion of the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, but the biggest thing that has been going on is the IDF has been expanding this new corridor. It is developing a new security corridor that really is called the Morag corridor that really carves up the Gaza Strip in another part between Han Yunis and Rafah, which is another area in southern Gaza. That is important for two reasons. One, it's been rumored within Israel and the IDF that once Israel ordered the evacuation of Palestinian civilians from Rafah, the most southern town in the Gaza Strip, Israel is actually planning on creating a buffer zone throughout that entire city, flattening it and making it another part of the buffer zone between Gaza and Egypt. That constitutes 1/5 of the Gaza Strip's territory. Is that actually the IDF's plan? At this point, it's impossible to know. But setting up a security corridor there is very similar to what the IDF did in northern Gaza, in the Tzarim corridor, when it really went into northern Gaza, to some extent decimated the area throughout the first stages of the war. So possibly that's what the IDF is planning. A second thing that is important to note is that as the IDF continues to deepen its ground invasion of the Gaza Strip, only today, for the first time, and maybe this is an indication of things to come, maybe not, we have seen reports of active fighting on the ground, that the IDF forces were attacked by militants in the southern parts of the Gaza Strip. Until now, we have seen almost no reaction from Hamas, which has been very uncharacteristic for the war. We've seen Hamas fire rockets into Tel Aviv, fire rockets into other areas in Israel, but there's been no fighting on the ground in the Gaza Strip where the IDF has been invading. Today was the first time that there was a report of an ambush of militants. It didn't say who. Hamas didn't take responsibility yet, neither did the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It just said the terrorists were responsible for opening fire in the southern parts of the Gaza Strip against the IDF. But that is really possibly the biggest development that has happened since we last spoke. Is maybe we're going to see a return to more active fighting in the Gaza Strip, which is really going to slow down the IDF's continued invasion. Again, that's speculation at this point, but till now, Hamas is not engaged on the ground. That just happened a few hours ago.
Negotiations? Are there still discussions about another phase of a truce? Are there still negotiations about what happens with Gaza in the long term?
So that's another arena that there's been a lot of developments in the last week, mostly rumors. What happened is Egypt put forth its own new proposal, which was for we trying to meet Israel and Hamas somewhere in the middle. Hamas originally said that possibly it would agree to go forth. Hamas wants a total deal, but it would be willing to go to maybe a temporary deal for maybe 5 live hostages. Israel said that it would want 11 live hostages. Egypt put forth a deal that 8 hostages would be released in exchange for a truce of between 40 to 70 days, the release of hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinian prisoners, as well as the entrance of humanitarian aid, and most importantly, continued and advanced negotiations towards phase 2 of the deal, which is the complete ceasefire, IDF withdrawal, and end to the war. Israel, meanwhile, sent a counteroffer, and Israel pretty much is accepting most facets of that deal, with the exception of the complete ceasefire and end to the war. That is one thing that Israel said it is not willing to give no matter what deal is on the table. Israel is adhering to what's called the Witkoff proposal, which is for the release of 11 live hostages and then an extended temporary truce that possibly will lead then to more negotiations, but no obligations. That's really where we are right now. Meanwhile, the United States has been saying that a deal is very close. Trump told the hostages that he met, freed hostages, that a deal is close and they'll be hearing about this soon. Steve Witkoff also said to family members of hostages, we are very close. In Israel, this is being denied. In Israel, it's being said, no, we're actually not that close. There are still very, very big differences between the sides. Hamas also not exactly saying we're close, saying we received the Egyptian proposal and we are considering it, but we're not actually anywhere closer to a deal. Possibly the United States is seeing this in a different light. Possibly they're seeing that they're going to compel Israel, or maybe ask Egypt and Qatar to compel Hamas into something. So on the one hand, there's a lot of rumors that things are developing and there are active negotiations. On the other hand, the two active parties, Israel and Hamas, are actually saying, no, we're nowhere closer than we were before. We're just currently talking about the different phases, different sides. I will just say where the big sticking points between the sides are is really that question of what happens after the hostages are released and the ceasefire is signed. Hamas is adhering to phase 2 of the deal, which means a complete ceasefire, IDF withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, and they have said they're not releasing hostages unless that is guaranteed. Israel is repeatedly saying it is not going to accept a complete ceasefire and IDF withdrawal unless Hamas is dismantled and disarmed, and therefore it is willing to talk about any temporary deal that you want. It will talk about, but is not going to